First Peter tonight. I think it's been an exciting study. I hope it has for you. There's some much more personal things in chapter 5. Peter has come to the end of his theological burden, and now he's just going to say a word to some of his fellow ministers in the church and some goodbyes and kind of wrap things up. Notice in chapter 5, verse 1, a word that only appears one place in all the Bible, and that's the term, so as a joint elder with them. Now, the word elder you're familiar with, but this is the word soon, a little bitty preposition put in front of the word elder. And soon means joint participation with or together with. So what he's saying is, as a joint elder, a fellow elder, a co-elder. Now, what is an elder? I've accused my old deacons of being that, but they don't buy it. So, what is an elder? Well, let's look biblically quickly at the use of the term. If we go back to the Old Testament, elders appear in the tribes of Israel. They were the older leaders of the tribes, chieftains, whatever you want to call them. Remember in Exodus 18 where Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, comes to visit Moses, and he says, you can't possibly keep this kind of work up, because it's just too much for you. You need to appoint elders. So, he appoints these tribal leaders to help him judge. You find that in Exodus 18, Numbers 11, 16 through 30. Now, in the New Testament, we also hear the term elders in a Jewish sense. Remember when the representatives from the Sanhedrin are spoken of in the Gospels, and they're usually called the, what? High priest, scribes, elders. Okay, so that would be the local leaders of Jerusalem. But in these later New Testament books, the pastoral epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, Peter, elder comes to be a little more technical term for a leader in the early church. Now we must remember that most early church local leaders were volunteers who worked for a living and did this on the side. It wasn't for a while until a paid clergy developed. Now, Paul talks about that a paid clergy is appropriate, but basically he's speaking of missionaries and evangelists, itinerant people. Most local people, though they had given responsibilities, were not paid in the earliest church. Now, notice he says a witness, the idea here is an eyewitness of the suffering borne by Christ. And here Peter is asserting that he is an eyewitness and companion of the Lord. As a matter of fact, I see several allusions through here several times. The first allusion I see is when it talks about the glory that is to be uncovered. I think Peter's talking about the transfiguration. We see it first in Matthew 17, Mark 9, 2 through 8. I think it's made an allusion to in 2 Peter 1, 16 and 17. Another allusion to Peter watching this transfiguration. And a little bit further down where it talks about putting on the apron. See if I can find that real quickly. No, it's here. I just studied it. I'll find it when I get there. I think it's an allusion to the foot washing in John 13 that Peter was so reluctant to participate in, but finally did. So I think we have an internal witness here. This is Peter the apostle. Notice where it says, I beg the elders among you. Now, I want to stop for a moment. There's a lot of confusion between these three terms for leadership people in the church. There is the term elder, which we get the term presbyteroi. So what denominational tag do we usually get there? Presbyterians. There is the term episcopoi, which usually translates in your English Bible, overseers or bishop. We get the word episcopal from that. And then there's the term you're more familiar with, and that is pastors, shepherds. Okay? There's been a lot of discussion. Is there a difference between elders, bishops, and pastors? I think that's a good question. And many churches have staffs, pastoral staffs, elders, and deacons. Well, based on two passages, I think they are synonymous. And those two passages you ought to write down and look up for yourself, okay? First of all, it is Acts 20, verses 17 and 28. This is the Ephesian elders. They're also called bishops or overseers. And then the one I think is the best is Titus chapter 1, verses 5 and 7, where they're used synonymously. Now, in this passage before us, we have all three of these groups mentioned. You see the word elders there. You see the word shepherds in verse 2, right? But you may not see the word overseers. Now, do any of you have the New International Translation? New International? Anybody? Well, it says exercising oversight. Instead of being in charge, it says exercising oversight. And that manuscript variation is in the Bottomer Papyri, which is the oldest form of Greek New Testament we have, written on papyri. It is in Aleph, and it is in A, which means Sinaiticus and Alexandrinus. And those are the three most ancient manuscripts we have. So I really think all three are mentioned here, even though probably my New American Standard didn't have that, and neither does Williams, but that is an excellent manuscript variation. Okay. Now, when it comes to the term, by the way, before I leave that, I want to say a word to you. You notice it's plural? Notice the plural of elders in verse 1, the plural of shepherds in verse 2, the plural of you yourselves in verse 3, the plural of elders down in verse 5. I want to tell you, the early church did not have one pastor. It had multiple pastors in charge, probably, can't be dogmatic, probably, of respective areas of ministry. And I think that's important we see that. Now, the word shepherd, you're familiar with that, of course, from Psalms 23, from Psalms 100, verse 3, from Ezekiel 34, verses 7 through 10, and John 21:16, where John talks to Peter about tend my flock. And then, of course, Jesus is called the Good Shepherd in John 10. Notice down in, if you'll skip down to verse 4, it says, when the chief shepherd appears, the arch shepherd. Have you ever heard a pastor called the under shepherd? Now, that term is never in the Bible, under shepherd. It comes from this passage where Jesus is called the arch shepherd, and so all the regular shepherds would be under shepherds. And that's this passage right here. And then there's four things, I think, that I would say to Christian leaders. This is very similar to 1 Timothy 3, 1 and following, on the qualifications for deacons and pastors. I would add this to this passage, to the qualifications for leaders in the church. Whatever we call them today, these would be for godly leaders, men and women. Listen to what it says. Number 1, not as though you had to, but of your own free will. It always helps not to be coerced into doing responsibilities in the church. I've worked in church long enough to know that the way we get workers is to prod them, embarrass them, goad them, or manipulate them to doing something quite often. Matter of fact, many people I know in the ministry did not volunteer. They were drafted. I feel I was drafted. It was not something I wanted to do. So this does not mean that initially the call of God, it's not talking about that. It's just saying that it needs to be, once you understand God's will, you need to function in it. Now, there are people who want to be in the ministry, who want to be leaders, and that is not put down. If you look at 1 Timothy 3:1, it says, if you desire the offer of bishop, you desire a good work. So there's nothing wrong with wanting to do that if you want to be a leader in the church. But it's not a prerequisite to have to want to. And then the second one I think is very important. Not from a motive of personal profit, but freely. Now, Paul was always nervous about this, wasn't he? He kept saying over and over again, I'm not doing this for money. In Corinth, I won't take money for you. He took a little money from Philippi. I think he probably took some money from Thessalonica, but he would not take any from Corinth. None. Because of this charge, you're just preaching for money. Now, he mentions that several times to Timothy and Titus in the pastoral epistles. And that's 1 Timothy 3:2 and Titus 1:7. You might want to look at that. Then number 3, not as domineering it over those in your charge. Have you ever been in a church where the pastor was a dictator? Well, they run rather freely, but they're just not the best example of New Testament polity. I remember the passage where Jesus talks about, says, you know, the world looks at lordship by how many people you have power over, but it will not be so with you. A leader among you will be one who serves all. So in the church, the statue of a leader is not in his administrative ability or power, it's in his level of service. We need to hear that. Now, the other thing I want to mention here, this is a proof text for many groups who believe in the episcopal system or the bishop system of organizing the church. Now, this word, those in their charge, in verse 3, this is the English term clergy. Originally meant a lot or a drawing. Now, do you see how they could use this for that point of view? Not as domineering it over those clergy in your charge is a possibility from the Greek. And many people use this for that. Now in verse 4, but proving yourselves, plural, models for the flock to imitate. I want to tell you what, I like Ephesians 4:1 where it says, walk worthy of the calling wherewith you've been called. Friends, if you ever hear somebody preach the good news and live the bad news, they're not from God. You hear me? Our walk and our talk must mesh in a beautiful relationship of life. It is not Sunday only that we're looking for. It's lifestyle Christianity. And that's the idea here. As Christian leaders should model the love, forgiveness, and all the other qualities of Christ they want others to emulate. Now in verse 4, and when the chief shepherd, arch shepherd, now we'll see John 10:1 through 18, appears. This is the word clearly reveals. You may have it in English as manifest. King James translates that way a lot. You'll receive the glorious crown. This is the word, we get the English name Stephen from this Greek word, Staniphos. It means a victor's crown. I think for us in our culture, probably a better thing would be you get the Olympic gold. Okay? That's the same idea. That never fades. This is a little, this word comes from a flower that if you cut it, it would wither immediately. But if you put it in water, it would come back to life. And as long as you kept this flower in water, it would never fade. And it came to be a metaphor for the unfadingness of spiritual things. It's the same idea is found in 1 Peter 1:4 about the unfadingness of heaven. The same word is used here. Verse 5. Now I want you to notice we're getting back into a very Pauline theology. You younger men on your part must be submissive to the elders. Now, two things I want to say. First, I want to look at the word elder here again. It's the very same word, presbyteroi. Here, it seems that we're talking not to leaders in the church, but to older men. Now, this word has both of those connotations. It can mean leaders, or it can mean older, respected, revered men in the community. Now, in 1 Timothy 5:1, Paul seems to talk about older men. In 1 Timothy 3, he seems to talk about leadership. And so I think the word has both connotations. To me, verse 5 is talking about older men. There should be a respect in the church between older ladies and older men. And it should be something that we do because it's appropriate. Now, the term submissive starts a series of imperatives. Now, imperatives are commands. If you believe the Bible is the authoritative self-revelation of God, imperatives are God's will for your life and the strong affirmation for you to walk ye in them. So let me quickly read all of the imperatives that are going to follow, and then I'll come back and talk to them. Be subject. Put on the servant's apron. There's that thing about foot washing. Submit, humbly submit, another aorist imperative. Cast every worry upon him. Be calm, be alert, resist, stand firm. All imperatives, all aorist. Once and for all. Make this a manner of life. Now the word submit is something we don't like much. It's a military term that means to align oneself under authority. But I want to say something to you. I want you to listen to me. I hear a lot in our day about women being submissive. And that is true. But the reason that women are to be submissive is because the universal principle between all believers, leaders and non-leaders, husbands, wives, older men, younger men, the whole gamut of Christian interpersonal relationships, the universal principle is in Ephesians 5:21. Be ye subject one to another out of respect for Christ. Every relationship ought to be characterized by a stepping back and putting others to the front. Now, the normal human tendency is what? Step to the front. The Spirit-led tendency is to step back and put others to the front. It'd make all the difference in the world if we only practice that. Now, and you must put on the servant's apron. Now, this put on again is an aorist middle imperative. I want to make a distinction. I hope you have one of our sheets on the definition of Greek terms. If you don't, I'll give them to you after the service. Aorist means once and for all action, completed action. When it's a passive, aorist passive imperative, it means that an outside agent is doing the work of the imperative. God is going to build you up. once and for all would be an aorist passive imperative. But aorist middle means that the subject of the sentence participates in the action of the verb. So when it's aorist middle imperative, it would mean you yourself, put on. Now, do you catch the cooperation? I really believe that God is at work in our lives. But God has chosen only to work in our lives in the area that we yield to Him. He is only willing to work when we cooperate. And so the Bible varies between God will do it and we must do it. And they're both true. They seem paradoxical. Both are true. So here we have be subject, and that's a passive verb, and then we have put on. Now the idea of put on here is that biblical metaphor so common in Paul about putting on clothes or taking off clothes. And how many times in Paul have you heard him say, strip off the old man, or strip off this, put on this? It's clothing used in a spiritual sense of qualities of the person. Take off the qualities of the sin nature. Put on the qualities of the Son of God is what it's talking about. The servant's apron of humility to one another, because God opposes the haughty, but bestows His unmerited favor on the humble. This is a quote from Proverbs 3:34. And the word opposes is an interesting word. It means to array oneself against. How would you like to have God arrayed against you? Well, if not, climb off that pedestal of pride, self-centeredness. Take the backward step. It's very hard to do. It's almost impossible except in the Holy Spirit. Therefore, humbly submit. There's that word again. To God's strong hand. Now, we must remember that God is omnipotent, all-powerful. But I don't love Him because He's all-powerful. Do you? Are you attracted to God because He's all-powerful? I'm attracted to God because He's a daddy. I'm attracted to Him because of His love, not because of His power. So we've got to realize the God we love is all-powerful. There's an awness there. But He's also the God that has bidded us to come in Jesus Christ. He's not an umpire. He's not a judge. He's not a policeman. He's a daddy. And He wants us to come and sit in His lap and talk to Him anytime we want to through Christ. God's strong hand, so at the proper time He may exalt you. Friends, there's going to be a day that you're going to be lifted up. It's just not going to be now. It'll be then. It'll come. Cast your every worry upon Him. Psalm 55:2 and following. Maybe it's 22. Some other passages, that's another aorist imperative I thought about here, is Matthew 6:25 through 38 about anxiety. Philippians 4:6, beautiful passages on anxiety. And look at the beauty of the grace, of the wonder of the message of God. Why do we cast every worry upon Him? Well, He can handle it and we can't. That's obvious. But the second one is, look at me, because He cares for you. Think what I'm saying. The Creator, Redeemer, the Speaker of worlds, the Controller of destinies, the Judger of men's hearts, cares about you. Really cares about you. Knows you. Wants you more than anything to know Him more and more. Verse 8, be calm and alert. Both aorist imperatives again. A similar statement as this is found in chapter 1, verse 13, and chapter 4, verse 7, where it uses the metaphor, be sober-minded. Be alert. Be careful. Your opponent, your legal adversary. You might want to see Romans 8:31 and following. There are several places in the Old Testament where a court scene is depicted where God brings His people to court. In the New Testament, it's the devil that brings God's people to court. And God is the judge. Jesus is the defense lawyer. That's basically the term parakletos means. We use the Holy Spirit in John 14 through 16, use of Jesus in 1 John 2:1. It's a court scene. If you want to see a beautiful court scene, you ought to see Romans 8:31 and following. If God be for us, who can be against us? That whole passage is a court scene. And that's what the devil's going to try to do, accuse us. Now, notice where it mentions here, your legal opponent, the devil. Now, what is the term for devil? What's back? You've heard it before. It's close in Spanish. What's the term for devil in Spanish? Diabolos. Okay, that's real close to Greek. Now, that comes from two words in Greek. Dia, which means through or across, and bole, which means to throw. We get the word bolo from it, don't we? So the word diabolos means to throw across. Well, what's he going to throw across? Well, he's going to throw across problems. He's going to throw across doubt. He's going to throw across accusations, right across our path. Now, the Old Testament term for this man is what? Satanus, which means the accuser, the liar, the deceiver. In the Old Testament, the term devil is one who brings a false accusation against another. You catch the legal aspect of someone accusing you before God? You see it so clear in the book of Job in the prologue, chapter 1. And that's what he's still doing to us today. He is always prowling about like a roaring lion, trying to devour you. If you ever see that, you'll understand what the temptation is all about. Look at verse 9. Resist him. Aorist imperative. Doesn't that sound just like Ephesians 6:13 and James 4:7? It is possible for human beings as weak as they are, as fallen as they are, with the indwelling Holy Spirit in faith to resist the evil one. And you know what he'll do? He'll flee from you. Now, we learn from the Gospels, he'll flee from you for a season, but he'll flee from you. Friends, the power of the name of Jesus has already overcome the forces of evil, and the very mention of his name causes them to flee. Resist him, be strong in faith, because you know your brotherhood all over the world is experiencing the same sort of suffering. I want to remind you, sometimes people come to me and say, Bob, you don't know what I'm going through. You're right. I don't have to. I know this. 1 Corinthians 10:13. There is no temptation been given you, but that is common to man. And God will never tempt you above that you're able to bear, that he won't give you a way of escape. Friends, persecution, problems, pressure are the norm for the Christian life. Don't you remember chapter 4 in 1 Peter, verse 12? Why does it surprise you when fiery trials come upon you, as though some strange thing were happening? The whole church of Jesus Christ is under pressure because of her unique, radical difference in the world. And the tragedy of the modern church is that we're so captured by society, there is no obvious distinction between the children of God and the children of the evil one in our culture. That's why the church is so weak and powerless in our day. She has no distinctiveness. Everyone in the church is experiencing these same kind of problems and pressures that Peter's talking about. Verse 10. And God, the giver of every spiritual blessing. Boy, I like that. Remember back in chapter 4, verse 10, we talked about that word that meant the variegated graces of God? The same word used earlier in the book meant the variegated temptations of the evil one, the trials, the problems. For every temptation, problem, need, pressure, persecution, there is a matching and commensurate grace of God. Hang in there. It will be worth it all when we see him. He's providing our needs even now. Who through your union with Christ has called you. Well, there's the emphasis on election. The word called. Called you to eternal glory after you have suffered a little while. Oh, we don't like that. Friends, Hebrews says that Jesus was perfected by the things that he suffered. Not his divine aspect, but his human. If Jesus, the Son of God, had to go through pressures, problems, to be all that God wanted him to be, don't you know you are? I guess the passage that gets to me the quickest about suffering is Romans 8, 18 through 39. It's that same passage that deals with the court scene in heaven, 31 through 39. But 18 through all of that is saying pressures are here, but they have a place. There's a purpose in evil in the plan of God for believers. For God has the brilliant capacity of taking that which is evil for his and turning it in that which is a blessing. Is that not what the cross of Christ is all about? I think it is. He will make himself, he himself make you three things: perfect, firm, and strong. Now he's been telling us to be strong and firm all along. Notice the play here between make yourself strong, firm, stand, and God will do it. There's always that tension. It's God that worketh in us to will and to do his good pleasure, but we have to allow him to do it. This is the results of suffering. Perfection. Now, we've always had a problem with that term perfection for English-speaking people. Perfection for me means without flaw, without error, without problem. Is that what perfection means to you? Something that's pure, It's not at all what the New Testament means. It was used of, this will surprise you, when you go out and buy those little frying chickens, they're all about the same size, aren't they? It was used of a chicken that's got old enough to cook. It's used of a ship that has been outrigged for sea, fully equipped. It's used of a bone that is fully knit together. If I could paraphrase it for English-speaking people, perfect means fully equipped to perform the assigned task. Whether it's maturity, resources, circumstances, whatever, fully equipped to perform the assigned task. Firm and strong are obvious. And Peter breaks out in a doxology again. To him be dominion forever. Amen. And then I think at this point, I think Peter took the pen in his own hand. I think Silvanus has been writing this. Because there's a lot of fight over, did Peter write 1 Peter and 2 Peter? The Greek is very different. 1 Peter is very good Greek. 2 Peter is horrendous Greek. I think Peter used Silvanus on 1 Peter and tried to write it himself. I think he was bilingual. We know that from the Gospels. But I think he tried to write 2 Peter, and it was horrendous. But he tried it. Silvanus is, you know him for Paul. He's called Silas by Paul, and he was Paul's companion on his second missionary journey. Silas is a Roman citizen, but Jewish. Very great man, very learned man. You might want to say Acts 15:40. Now, I have written you this short letter to encourage you and testify. This is the true, unmerited favor of God. Stand firm in it. Aorist imperative. Friend, one of the greatest things you can do as a Christian is know the truth and stand in it. There's so many pulls to get us out of the truth. That's what the evil one's trying to do, just get us off track a little bit. He'll thwart everything in growth and witness and on and on. Stand firm in the truth that you know. Now, notice where it says your sister church. Well, that's the word she in Babylon. Now, there's three things that Babylon could possibly mean. From the book of the Revelation, the term Babylon seems to be used for the world system apart from God, which in John's day would have been Rome. Let me give you a few references. Revelation 14:8, 17:5, 18:2, and 10. Okay? Now we know that Mark was in Rome. He's going to be mentioned this same verse from Colossians 4:10 and 18. Tradition links Peter with Rome, as you know. And I really think this letter is written to Romans, Roman Christians. Now there is two other Babylons. There's one in Mesopotamia where a lot of Jews lived, which would be possible for Peter to be right from there, but we have no record of him being there. And the other one is a little small remote military outpost in the Nile Delta, which seems very unusual and very improbable. I think it's Rome. Chosen along with you. There's an idea of election. Now the churches being called elect and being called women is quite common for 2 John and 3 John. With Mark, my son. Now Papias, a very early writer, a hearer of John the Apostle, and a friend of Polycarp, says that Mark is the companion and interpreter of Peter. This is a copy of the Ante-Nicene Fathers. If you never have read some of the early church fathers, you might want to read this. This is Papias, one of his fragments. Mark, having become an interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately whatsoever he remembered. It was not, however, in exact order that he related the sayings or deeds of Christ, for he neither heard the Lord nor accompanied him. But afterwards, as I said, he accompanied Peter, who accommodated his instructions to the necessities of his hearers, but with no intention of giving a regular narrative of the Lord's sayings. So here we have John Mark. Now that's Barnabas's nephew. That's the guy who went with Paul on his first journey, and Paul and Barnabas had such a fight over, and later Paul said, send John Mark to me, for he is helpful in the ministry. He later became, after the death of Paul, a companion of Peter, and the whole Gospel of Mark is a recollection of the Apostle Peter. Now, wish to be remembered to you, greet one another with a kiss of love. How long has it been since you had a holy kiss? Peggy and I practice it often. We're trying to keep up in the New Testament. But in the early church, everybody kissed. Everybody. How would that to come to church? And wouldn't we spread coals rapidly if all of us kissed one another? The early church used to do this quite often, especially at the Eucharist or love feast. Let me give you a few references. It'll surprise you how many. Romans 16:16, 1 Corinthians 16:20, 2 Corinthians 13:12, 1 Thessalonians 5:26. But by the 4th century, it was obvious it was causing a problem. It really was. And so the church didn't quit it. But when you go to Russia today, how do you get greeted? When you go to France, how do you get greeted? When you go to an Arab country, how do you get greeted? Well, depending on what country, you get kissed on one cheek or both cheek. I'd just soon not kiss at all if I got to kiss a hairy fella, It just doesn't do a whole lot for me. So it kind of passed away. I think our patting and hugging is probably as close as we can get in our day. Well, that closes 1 Peter. I think it's a wonderful book by a great man of faith.